Support for Live in 225 is provided in part by the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research at Cal Poly. For more information or to support the center, please visit organic.calpoly.edu. That's organic.calpoly.edu for the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research at Cal Poly. Support for Live in 225 is provided in part by AgCom Central. Visit AgCom Central on twitch.tv/AgCom Central or on our website, agcomcentral.com, where you can follow our social media. That's twitch.tv/AGCOMM Central for AgCom Central. Support for Live in 225 is provided in part by the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication at Cal Poly. Visit aged.calpoly.edu to register for our programs or to show your support. That's aged.calpoly.edu for the Department of Agricultural Education and Communication at Cal Poly.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us here. We are live in 225, and this is Season 1, Episode 4. Throughout this podcast, we're going to be mentioning all sorts of technical terms about organic agriculture, and a lot of us don't really know exactly what they mean. So today we're just going to be diving into that topic. We're going to be exploring all of the different terms and definitions that circulate around the organic ag industry. And that will just help better inform us as we continue on through this podcast. We are also going to be defining some terms to better understand the switch in interest from conventional ag to other methods of farming, as well as the definitions of some of those growing practices that are used in organic agriculture. Today on the panel, we have some lovely guest panelists. We have Tegan, who's in the production class. Say hello.
Hello, everyone. I am on the panel list today.
Tell us a little about yourself.
I am a senior this year at Cal Poly. I'm graduating in spring. An AgCom major. I actually did work on this episode of the podcast as well, so I'm super excited.
It's very lovely to have your expertise on the podcast. Next up, we have Dr. Grieshop. Say hello, introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Matt Grieshop. I'm the director of the Grimm Family Center for Organic Production and Research. I'm here at Cal Poly, a new center focused on research and education around organic agriculture.
Lovely having you. And as always, we have our professor for this Live in 225 production class. We have Dr. Mike.
Yeah, one of your favorite AgComs professor in all of the state of California. I just want to say that a lot of people have been hearing about this podcast and they're interested. I think we'll blow up soon. So Natalie, look out for your fandom coming soon
fandom.
to you. Yeah.
Oh boy, I can't wait. And as always, I'm Natalie Victorine. I am the host for this Live in 225 podcast, and I am a second-year AgComs major.
Yeah.
With that being said, and all the introductions being introduced, let's dive into it.
Yeah.
So the first topic that we're going to be discussing is organic agriculture. So we're just going to define that and have a little discussion about it.
Well, let me just interject here. I'm wondering if we should play the man on the street interviews first and then see what the perspective is of the man on the street and then dive into individual. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we could do that.
Yeah.
So in this one, I know we're going to say it right in the beginning of this video, but we actually went out and spoke to different students on campus about what they thought the difference between organic and sustainable agricultural practices were. So it was really interesting. I hope you guys enjoy it on the panel because you haven't seen this yet. So,
all right, production. Great. Let's see it.
I am here at Campus Market. I'm going to ask a couple people about the difference between organic ag and sustainable agriculture.
Can you tell me the difference between sustainable agriculture and organic ag?
No.
No? Okay, thank you.
Probably not, but I feel like I should.
If you don't know, that's totally cool too.
I would guess that sustainable is more about reuse and organic is about the products you're using.
Cool, perfect, thank you.
Sustainable agriculture, this is hard. Sustainable agriculture is using the least amount of environmentally toxic products that you can, and then organic agriculture is not using. It could be like using chemicals, but not like I don't know actually.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
I do not.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Organic agriculture versus sustainable. I don't see them as mutually exclusive.
Huh.
I see that they could overlap. There could be both.
Good answer. Do you know the difference between organic agriculture and sustainable agriculture?
Is organic agriculture more like no GMOs, and then sustainable is more working on like sustainability of keeping up that?
Pretty much.
Not off the top of my head, but I could guess.
Do you want to shoot something out?
Sure. Is organic ag like agriculture without like preservatives and pesticides, and like sustainable ag is like regenerative agriculture where they're like rotating crops and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank.
No. No, I don't.
Okay. Cool. Thank you.
No, do you? Organics more, like, I don't know, grassroots.
Like natural.
Yeah, natural, not as industrial.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, organic would be like, I guess stuff like from nature and the ground. And what was the other one?
Sustainable agriculture.
Sustainable. Maybe like genetically engineered. I'm not sure.
Okay. Thank you.
So organic, I think, has emphasis on particularly like which products you're using, or if you're using any on the agriculture. So like what kind of, if you're using any pesticides, which I think typically is like you don't want to use any of that, versus sustainable agriculture is looking more about the processes that you're going about like treating agriculture. Like how much water are you using? Are you taking into account kind of the climate you're in, or are you trying to force a product to grow in a climate that it's not suited for, and like acknowledging more of the resource impacts rather than the product impacts?
Perfect. Thank you.
No.
Okay. Thank you. Can you tell me the difference between organic ag and sustainable agriculture?
There's not a whole lot. I'm not the best expert on this.
Totally fine. Just give us whatever you want to say.
Organic is mostly marketing. Some people think there's taste difference, there's health difference, but there's not really. So you can't use conventional pesticides, but you have to use lighter loads of pesticides.
I just want to shout out Melissa for literally saying, yeah, you're
yeah, pretty much.
Because that's how they do it on social media, right? They let people answer and like, you know, all right, cool, you did it. And sometimes she just kind of walked away from them like, that's not right.
There was definitely a wide variety of answers, some of which were quite comical. But hey, that's what we're here for. We're here to educate. We're here to. It's ag comms. We're all here. We're all going to educate ourselves on organic agriculture. So the USDA National Library of Agriculture defines organic ag as a system that integrates cultural, biological, and mechanical practices that foster cycling of resources, promote ecological balance, and conserve biodiversity. Dr. Grieshop, would you like to add on to what you would define organic agriculture as?
Yeah, so it's nuanced. But first, I did want to say that I was really impressed with Melissa's grit in going out there and tracking down people and getting answers from them. That takes some grit.
I did make her go up to quite a few people she didn't want to go up to.
Well, she did it.
Yeah,
that's what's important.
We were in it together.
Yeah, that's good.
Fantastic.
Well, it's all about teamwork. So back to the question at hand. So organic agriculture. The first and foremost thing is that there is a legal definition within the United States for organic agriculture, and that's really under the parlance of the USDA Agriculture Marketing Service National Organic Program. So they define organic agriculture pretty close to the definition that was just given. And there's a real emphasis on sort of the inputs used in that system. I mean, that's really where that definition is headed. So it's really about, and a couple of the folks on the street really tackled this using non-synthetic inputs, whether that's for protecting plants from pests or diseases, or fertility products, so the types of fertilizers that are used. But the organic movement, which has been around a lot longer than the certified organic ag in the U.S., which is really started in 2002, the emphasis is really on the development of a more of a holistic soil-based agriculture, where you're fostering healthy, biologically active soil, and all those inputs and everything are sort of what go into that process. So I could tackle sustainable ag too.
Yeah. So the one of the biggest things that I noticed in the video was the overlap between sustainable and organic, and a lot of people that were interviewed thought that they were mutually exclusive.
I just thought it was almost like a trick question.
Yeah,
because
they were thinking a little too hard about it.
I feel like if you did a Venn diagram, one would fit in the other.
Yeah.
And if I were to think about it, because I'm no organic expert, I could communicate about it. I would say that organic production fits somewhere in the overall realm of sustainable agriculture.
But just like Dr. Grieshop said, it has a legal definition.
Yeah,
right. And so that's the biggest difference, I'd say, is that sustainable ag, at least in the United States, and I don't know of any political economic boundaries where this would be the case. I don't think there is a legal definition for sustainable ag. So that would be the first difference. But I would say
there is a legal definition provided by the USDA.
USDA, yeah.
Oh, but there's not like a fine or there's not a label.
No.
So it's like I can call anything I want sustainable.
Yep.
And organic, if I call something organic and I'm not certified,
Then
I'm
it's
looking
not
at $10,000 per violation.
Wow.
And potentially jail time. So yeah, when I say legal definition, there's not a lot
Legal
of enforcement,
repercussions.
unfortunately, but there's actual legal repercussions for using that word in a way that doesn't fit the legal definition. So, but Dr. Mike, I think, is pretty much right in line with my sort of thoughts on it. Is I look at sustainable ag as a big umbrella, and so there's a lot of different styles of agriculture that could fit under a sustainable umbrella. But the first thing that I think is really critical when folks start using the word sustainable, whether it's in you're talking about an agricultural system or you're talking about an energy system or anything else, the most important first thing to think about is over what time scale. And that's a piece I see left out, sort of a surprisingly frequent time. But, ultimately, nothing is sustainable forever. We're all finite. So it's really important, I think, if you use terms like that to think about. So sustainable over 100 years, 7 generations, 1 fiscal quarter. It really depends on what you're going to do, and what sort of fits under that umbrella is really going to be defined by that boundary. So that boundary is really important. Mm-hmm. And because of that, there are conventional ag practices like no-till agriculture and other practices where they use a lot of synthetic products, but they have some definite sustainability advantages by reducing tillage and doing other things.
That's one of the references I was going to draw. Organic agriculture is a part of sustainable agriculture, but conventional agriculture as well can be. Mm-hmm. You can do sustainable practices in conventional agriculture, and I don't want people to walk away from this podcast thinking that the only way you can be sustainable in agriculture is through organic. And like Matt always says, we're in it together. We have to work together and figure out the systems that work in which situations.
Yeah,
definitely.
The wonderful thing about organic agriculture, because it has a legal definition and there's a legal set of standards, it provides the stage for really a pretty much free market solution towards promoting sustainable ag practices, or a specific set of them. So, consumers pay a premium for organic produce, and that premium, at least some part of it, hopefully gets to the folks actually doing the practices. And I think that's the place where organics really shine in terms of the larger sustainable ag scene. As far as I know, I don't think anyone doing no-till grain farming in the Midwest gets a premium for their no-till practices. And it may be that they can make more money because they can produce more efficiently, and there's a lot of reasons why no-till is a great system. But unlike organics, there's not somebody saying, hey, you're being a good steward. We value, the fact that takes energy, time, and it's going to cut into your margin. Here's a little bit to help you continue going.
Yeah. I wanted to talk a little bit about biodynamic agriculture and just describing a little bit about that, because if general consumers don't know a whole lot about organics and sustainable, then they definitely probably do not know about biodynamics. I know that's something that I'm not very educated on.
Do we have some people on the street talking about biodynamics?
I don't believe so.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately.
So biodynamics are fascinating, and it's interesting. I mean, biodynamic agriculture actually predates organics, and there are elements of biodynamic agriculture that have fed into early organic practices. So biodynamic agriculture was really conceived by a single person, Rudolf Steiner, who is this really amazing...
Who's an Austrian philosopher.
Yeah, yeah. I mean...
Very interesting.
So he founded Waldorf schools. So, this alternative education system that sometimes looked similarly to Montessori, but it's not really based off Christian theology. But Waldorf schools are something that Rudolf Steiner developed. So Rudolf Steiner really focused on traditional, peasant European ag systems, which were, operating a long time before the beginnings of, synthetic inputs, so synthetic nitrogen, synthetic pesticides, everything else. And so biodynamics has a very similar set of principles to organics, but there are some key differences. The biggest of those are that there are a series of preparations that if you're going to be a biodynamic farmer, and you can get certified as a biodynamic farmer, it's not legally defined, but there's a third-party certification system called the Demeter Society, I believe. And basically, you have to use these preparations as part of your agricultural practices. And these preparations involve taking things like stinging nettles and cow manure and other European herbs and mixing them into cow horns and then burying them during different moon phases and then digging them up and then using those things to supplement your compost. And it's really interesting. And a lot of that goes into the fact that for Steiner, there is this definite metaphysical, spiritual component of agriculture. And, this gets back into sort of, old, basal European ag practices. So, pre-Dark Ages type stuff. And so there's this metaphysical balance. And early on, there were actually some arguments between the biodynamic movement and the organic movement. So this would be, 1940s and earlier, because the organic movement, initially at least, a lot of its founding thinkers like Sir Albert Howard were really into, well, we've got this law of return, we have to return fertility to the land, and that some of that is human wastes, that we should be harvesting these wastes and getting them back. So humanure is sort of the concept. In biodynamics, that was no, that's totally wrong, because there's a metaphysical imbalance that you're going to introduce to the system. And so that was one area where they really sort of clashed a little bit. And those two people, Sir Albert Howard and Rudolf Steiner, actually overlapped in time a little bit. Steiner died, right around the turn of the century. Sir Albert Howard died in, I want to say 1948. So Steiner's a little older, but they and their sort of acolytes interacted around that. So biodynamic has this. The other difference between biodynamic and organics in terms of certification is that if you certify a farm biodynamic, you have to certify the whole farm. A core concept is that the whole farm is this holistic sort of living spiritual organism. And
you can't produce just a little bit.
Right. Whereas organics, we very much, we have a lot of growers that, get into organics and they start out from a conventional, which is also weird because there's no legal definition of conventional ag, right? So it can be many things. But they'll start on a couple sections of their farm and sort of try out organic practices, and then, and then over time they either expand or stay the same, or sometimes they give it up. So that's a major difference between the two.
Yeah, you were talking a little bit about the push for organics and really how that started, and I think that would be considered the green revolution, as some like organic producers would say. And could you just describe a little bit more about that?
What's the definition?
The green revolution?
The green revolution
Yeah.
is stated to be a push of technology transfer initiatives that saw greatly increased crop yields, and that change really began after World War II and spread globally into the late 1980s.
Yeah, so there, the person you really have to talk about if you talk about the Green Revolution is Norman Borlaug. And Norman Borlaug was a grain breeder. The interesting thing is that Norman Borlaug's family farms organically, but Norman Borlaug, is credited with probably saving more lives than any single person in the 20th century. And
Really?
And it's really because of his breeding efforts. And so he was one of the really folks that pushed dwarf wheat varieties and breeding for disease resistance, and particularly a series of cereal rusts that attack wheat. And he was very involved with the Green Revolution in Mexico and India. And basically, by breeding wheat that was resistant to, regionally specific diseases, but then also responded very well to synthetic inputs, so synthetic nitrogen sources, et cetera, yields were greatly increased. And it's really, if you think about when I think about the Green Revolution, it's really, the pyramid is sort of, plant breeding on one side, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides to some extent on the other side, and then mechanization. And breeding, though, is really the major leg of that triangle. That's sort of, breeding plants that are easy to harvest mechanically, so that they mature all at the same time. They're the same size. A combine or a swather or something can get through there and cut it easily is a big part of that. But then also breeding them so that they respond to a synthetic mineralized fertility program. So in conventional agriculture, the sources of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium that are used, as well as micronutrients, are already sort of plant ready. They're set up in a way that plants can readily absorb them. In organic systems, we start with really amino acids and protein-based complex molecules that have to be processed by microbes before plants can access them. And that's closer to a natural system. That's how natural nutrient cycling functions. But to get plants to really thrive when, in the disconnect of those microbial processes of breaking up nutrients, there's some breeding that went on so that they responded really, they can handle sort of this mass rush of, available nutrition rather than a trickle, which would be more typical of a natural system.
Would you see this green revolution as like what we now consider more conventional agriculture?
Oh, absolutely.
Like with GMOs and all
I
that?
think genetically modified crops are really a logical extension of the Green Revolution. And so, and that's a really fascinating topic. What we define as genetically modified and what we don't at this point, sort of the history of plant breeding. So really, genetically modified crops, beginning in the mid 90s, right around the time the organic certification was getting set up for federal government, although it didn't get applied till 2002. Basically, breeders were able to synthetically introduce genes for herbicide resistance and insect resistance into a lot of our major commodity crops. So, one of the really funny things that I always chuckle with the genetically modified free foods and stuff is that I see that stamp on all kinds of foods where there are no genetically modified lines. Basically no one's done it. So
really?
Like,
there's no standard for?
Well, It's weird. I mean, so really, if you look at it, the major crops that are genetically modified and produced and consumed are really, corn, soybeans, cotton, sugar beets. I think there's a GM alfalfa now. There's a GM wheat, but it's never been released. Papaya is actually in Hawaii, but they did really minor modification there for a specific ring spot virus. Yeah, that's what really, they saved the Hawaiian papaya industry. They were collapsing. But those are really the major crops that are genetically modified. There is a 2-gene, they weren't modified through traditional genetic modification, but more recent gene silencing technology. But there's a non-browning Fuji apple and Granny Smith apple, I believe. And that's really about it. Oh, I'm sorry. And there's some rices out there. So there's golden rice, which was really modified to have high levels of vitamin A in it to help with human nutrition. And then there's a genetically modified line of rice that I think has been released that's flood tolerant. But the interesting thing on that whole GM piece is that really the development of genetically modified technology. So, back for 12,000 years since ag started, we've been crossing plants just naturally. So we're using, natural sexual processes to move traits that we like around. Like, the way we got carrots. Carrots started out as a green that people ate. They ate the greens and the seeds. And then somebody went, oh, well, there's just this nice taproot. We can eat that. And then they selected for carrots that had a big, meaty taproot, and now that's what we eat. You can eat carrot greens, but not
just
many
the
people
biggest
do.
difference with genetically modified foods now is
Right.
that instead of all of those generations of
Right.
crossbreeding, it's a direct
Right.
transfer of
But
genes
here's the-
from one crop to
Here's
another.
the goofy thing that keeps me up at night when thinking about this with organics is that, okay, so then the first real sort of genetically modification was through mutation breeding. And so seedless ruby red grapefruit is a product of mutation breeding. A lot of the dwarf grain varieties are from mutation breeding. And these are things that are actually used in organic ag. Basically what they did, this is kind of like in the Better Living Through Chemistry atomic era of
Comic
the
books.
1950s. They either expose plant embryos to gamma radiation, or they use oncogens, so chemicals that cause mutations in chromosomal mutations. And so the basic idea was back in the 50s and 60s was that, well, we can't always get the traits we want in our crops, so maybe we can cause crops to mutate so we can find them. So you take thousands of plant embryos, you expose them to one of these, mutating factors, and then you grow them, and most of them just croak, or die because they're they can't survive. But then you get one that's like, oh look, we've got a seedless red fleshed grapefruit. So then you can take that line and then go put it into a traditional breeding line and get that trait into the traditional breeding line. So that was really the first example of genetic modification beyond sexual selection in our plant breeding program. Then in the late 80s and 90s, we figured out, through PCR, polymerase chain reaction, and our ability to start isolating, tagging, and manipulating genes, we began injecting genetically modified DNA into plant embryos. And so they did this with this little gene shotgun to begin with. It was like a pneumatic gun that shot microscopic pellets of gold coated in plasmids into the nucleus of a developing plant embryo. And then it's sort of still kind of random. Like you just kind of shoot this genetic material in there, and maybe it attaches in a good place,
maybe
or maybe
it works, maybe it doesn't.
kills it. Exactly. So that's how we got Roundup Ready or glyphosate herbicide resistant crops. That's how we got our insect resistant crops that have genes from bacteria that produce a natural insecticide, Bacillus thuringiensis. So that's sort of where we were up through really the early 2000s. Now we have something called CRISPR-Cas9, and I am far from a molecular biologist, so I don't understand the mechanisms, but basically with CRISPR-Cas9, we can go into a genome and we can silence genes. So for instance, with that non-browning apple, they didn't add anything, they turned off a metabolic pathway that causes apples to get brown when they're exposed to oxygen. The other thing we can do is take gene snippets and put them in very specific parts of the genome. So, for example, there's a lot of breeding programs looking at this for disease resistance, where at my former employer at Michigan State University, they were working on a light blight resistant potato. Late blight is the causal agent of the Irish potato famine. So it's a Phytophthora infestans, and it's just a horrible pathogen. What they were able to do was go to an Andean, like early line potato, find one that was resistant to late blight, identify the gene that provided that, clone that gene, and then put it into, say, a russet potato. So a potato that's ready for market. It has the production, it has all that green revolution tech already built into it. And so within 5 years, they were able to create a potato that was 100% resistant to late blight. And they never went outside the potato genome to do that. All the genetic material came from potatoes. So that's kind of where we're living now in terms of genetic modification. And it's a personally, I can talk about this for an hour, so I will stop. But personally, I think there's some really interesting things on the horizon for the organic movement related to this.
Yeah.
Because I think we're probably within a decade or two.
Do you think that the organic industry would be open to adopting?
They're not. I mean, they're not at
foods?
all. Which for me, from a sustainable ag side, is unfortunate, because having disease resistance at the genetic level is really great, because it means you don't need things like copper or sulfur to manage
Less
plant
inputs.
diseases. Exactly, less inputs and better for your soil. But on the other hand, there are a lot of concerns about the sort of downstream potential impacts of this type of manipulation of genetic material. So right now, none of this is allowed under certified organic production. But I think the really big issue is going to be, from a conventional breeding standpoint, especially for things like fruits and vegetables, it takes, so in a perennial fruit, I've had plenty of colleagues who are like apple breeders and cherry breeders and things like that. They might release 1 or 2 new lines in their entire career. So, I mean, you're talking about somebody who's got, gone all the way up through a PhD. So they've got, like 20 years of school. They spend the next 20 to 25 years, and they might release 1 or 2 varieties, because it takes so long through just sexual recombination and growing a tree up to the point where you actually get fruit off it, that you just don't get a lot of time to play around.
Yeah.
So with CRISPR-Cas9, we can do things 4 to 5 times faster. So where I'm going with this is, in conventional breeding programs for vegetables and fruits, I suspect that in the next decade, 2 decades tops, we're going to see that technology completely dominate. And the challenge for the organics at that point is going to be, most of our organic breeds come out of conventional breeding programs. It's a smaller market, so we don't have the breeders, but sort of the cast-off things that are like, well, this one's, doesn't have quite the right color for the conventional market, for instance, but it's got good disease resistance. That goes into an organic breeding line. So the big question is if we get to this point where the plant breeding community is using this technology that the organic community won't accept, how are we going to get new organic varieties? And that's what I see as a big challenge for the next 2 decades. Like I said, I can talk for an hour on this. So
I wanted to divert the conversation and just open up discussion, and just ask everyone on the panel, what do you think the largest misconception about organic agriculture is? And just explain a little bit why.
Is it appropriate here, Matt, to talk about animals as well?
Yeah, from breeding or from organics, or?
One of the
both.
One of the definitions we do have on here is husbandry and the care and cultivation of breeding crops and animals generally, if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to my prompt or my response to that. I think a lot of the fears of, people consuming genetically modified organisms GMOs, is that they're afraid to see the stereotypical imagery that comes with genetic modification in a negative sense. So the 2-headed lamb, or the chicken with 4 legs, or the embryo that has like 6 yolks in it, or whatever. And so my opinion or my research experience has been of the I'm saying this terribly, but based on my research, what I understand is, especially husbandry breeders, when they breed their animals, sometimes they have to go through that process, that trial and error process, which takes time, as Matt said. And, they take that time to breed things in. And so with GMO technology, it makes more sense, especially from an animal perspective, to get it done quicker and maybe safer for animals that, come out on the back end of that process. And I think the fear is that consumers are going to be engaging or consuming products that they're not certain is of their standards of what they consider to be safe products. But I think the USDA does a good job of parameterizing what is safe and what is not safe to eat. I could be wrong here, but I just wanted to bring that animal side of things into it.
Yeah, well, this would apply to both plants and animals in the sort of second order genetic modification that I was talking about, where you're injecting novel genetic material into a genome. So for instance, you get a gene from a bacteria or a fish or something, and you incorporate that into a corn plant or maybe a chicken or whatever. There are some semi-valid health concerns in that you've got novel proteins that are going to show up, and sometimes folks can be allergic to those. But if you take the approach where you never leave the genome, so basically if the traits that I'm breeding chickens and all of the genes I'm using come from different lines of chickens, essentially what you're doing is you're accelerating the process of getting those traits into a new breed of chicken. So rather than having to have roosters and hens mate, 20, 30, 40, 50 times.
You're fast tracking the process to just
exactly.
a few generations.
And I think there is, from an animal husbandry and sort of animal welfare standpoint, there is actually some logic in that, because what happens to all those, genetic lines in between when you're doing the breeding and you have to go through 20 or 30 cycles? Well, they get destroyed. That's what happens to them. They don't get used for their intended purpose. They may not go anywhere. Whereas if you can speed that process along, you're going to have less sort of suffering in that process. So from that perspective, I think there's something to consider philosophically. In terms of husbandry and sort of animal standards and organics, this has been one of the big controversies really from the very beginning of certified organic production. And it really goes back to the fact that if you look at basal organic philosophy, the systems that were envisioned would always be animal and plant combined systems. But where we've gone in terms of modern agriculture is we've separated animals from plants. Mm-hmm. And from a food safety standpoint in produce industry, that's not something that's going to change. So I think that's led to a lot of sort of confusion about, well, what does an organic animal production system look like, especially if it's not integrated with a plant production system. Yeah. And so we've seen a lot of issues there, and there've been tons of lawsuits and a lot of lobbyist money and all kinds of things going into that, saying, well, and we've made some progress. When we first started with organic dairies, for instance, most of the large organic dairies were just conventional dairies where they fed cows organic corn and soybean. Beginning in the mid-2010s, there was a standard where basically you had to feed them some amount of dry matter that was actually what cows evolved eating, which is like grasses and plants, mm-hmm. not corn and soybeans. But it continues. Like what is an organic production system for animals? And I think even if you look at price differential, producing animals organically, the price differential for doing that versus producing them conventionally is far greater than producing plants organically than conventionally.
There's a lot of different inputs that go into that as well.
Well, and just, confinement. Mm-hmm. Confined animal feeding operations are, the reason they exist is that they get animals to market very, very quickly in a large quantity, mm-hmm. which means that the consumer experiences a very affordable product at the grocery store. I've raised animals on pasture, and it's like an order of magnitude more expensive to do it. Mm-hmm. And so if folks aren't willing to pay, $10 a pound for chicken versus $1 a pound, or right, I guess right now chicken's more like $2 to $4 a pound. How is the grower going to do that and maintain sort of financial sustainability?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your input. You definitely gave us a lot of insight onto this. Just wanting to wrap up, I wanted to ask Dr. Mike just really quickly.
Oh, gosh.
We talked a lot of terms and definitions in this episode, and I just wanted to bring it over to you for a quick second and just
what does this mean for AgComs, huh?
Yeah, what does this mean for AgComs? Like, how can just the general consumer and the general student at Cal Poly learn a little bit more about organic agriculture besides tuning into this podcast.
Especially since we did see a lot of Cal Poly students don't know what even organic agriculture is.
And this is a pretty big ag school, so just take that into a bigger perspective for a student in, let's say, USC or Berkeley or another college that might not have a college of agriculture.
I'm going to echo what Dr. Fry said when we had her on the podcast. You know, someone has to take the responsibility and, you know, ensure that the target audience get the information that they need. And so I guess as a point of reference, we absolutely knew the target audience we were going for. We were going for podcast listening audience, and I think a lot of college level students are engaged with podcasts, even though, you know, most of them talk about crime podcasts or serial killer podcasts. I mean, there is a subsection of podcast listeners that are interested in being educated about, you know, the things that they consume, especially in California, which is there are pockets of liberal individuals, especially around San Luis Obispo. So I have faith in us as, you know, a class, and you all as students who are taking this project on, you know, by the horns. And I think we're doing great things. It's a good start, and, you know, resources have to be put into this. But beyond this podcast, we're gonna do some great things with the information that we get and spread it to whoever we can.
And I, you know, one last thing I'd say to build off what Dr. Mike just brought up is, you know, for folks listening to this, talk to a farmer. I mean, go to a farmer's market, or if you live in an agricultural community, you know, go to the coffee shop, talk to some farmers, learn about you know, what farmers are doing in your area, and then if you can, even if it's just a window box, try growing some food. It could be herbs, it could be a tomato plant. I often say if I had a magic wand, it could make one thing happen. I'd have everybody grow a tomato plant. You know, every man, woman, and child in the country, and basically, you know, they'd be able to experience the joy and awe as this plant germinates and grows, and sort of the wonderful, you know, hey, look, there's fruit, and then the abject horror when tomato hornworm comes along and eats the whole thing, or late blight comes and collapses it. That's how we get more in touch with our food, I think, and our food system, and it, you know, everyone's going to do better if we can communicate about that.
There are definitely lots of ag publications that are out there that are kind of trailblazing. I know that one of the main hosts of Top Gear, which is like this car show, Jeremy Clarkson, has this show on Amazon Prime called Clarkson's Farm. And it's all about how he bought this plot of land in 2008, and then he's like, I'm going to farm it. So it's all about learning the ropes of farming and husbandry, and it's just a really interesting show. And I think that in the future, like, things like this podcast and things like that show would really just educate people and like present it to them in an aesthetic and a very like entertaining way, which I think is really cool. But just wrapping up, thank you to all of our panelists that came on the show today. That is our time for Live in 225. And thanks for just discussing and learning a little bit more about the terms and definitions of organic agriculture.
All right, see you guys next time. Great podcast.
Live in 225 is a production of the AGC 225 class at Cal Poly called Digital Communications and Agriculture. Program funding was provided by the California Certified Organic Farmers Foundation and the Transition to Organic Partnership Program. Our production team for this episode was Tegan Ellers and Melissa Frago. Our director for Season 1 was Bella Anushian. Our host was Natalie Victorine. The executive producer, creator, and co-editor for the show was Moses Mike. Matt Grieshop was our co-producer. Our guest for this episode was Tegan Ellers. Our audio technician was Melissa Frago, who was also our managing editor. The video switching director was Cole Stevens. Our vocal talent was Jared Mandrell. Background music by LVY Music from Pixabay. Intro and outro music by Alex Grohl from Pixabay. Thanks for joining us.